Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Michael Anselmo. I am the co-head of the Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access team here at MCRA. We're excited to host our webinar today entitled Reimbursement Considerations in Product Commercialization. Next slide, please. So just a quick introduction on MCRA. So we are a global CRO and integrated advisory firm. We have a deep therapy specialization and deep intelligence regarding regulatory, clinical trial, and reimbursement, as well as a number of other areas designed to support medical device firms. Next slide, please. Within our organization, we offer a full global clinical research organization. We additionally offer global regulatory expertise, reimbursement, health economics, and market access expertise, which is my unit. We also offer quality assurance and staffing, healthcare compliance and GDR compliance, cybersecurity, due diligence, and our new AI and imaging center. A wide variety of MCRA services to support all of our potential customer and client needs. Next slide, please. Just some quick logistics around the webinar today. So if you have any questions, please submit those using the Q&A function located on the bar at the top of the webinar screen. Additionally, if you'd like, you can put any questions in our chat. We will be recording this webinar, so your continued participation is consent towards recording, and we will send out a link and recording of the webinar to all registered participants. Additionally, we will make our slides available, so a PDF of the slides will be emailed after the webinar. Should you need to contact any of the presenters, including myself, content information will be included on a post-webinar email, or you can offer an email up to info@micra.com to connect to our entire team. Next slide, please. So joining myself on our webinar today will be Ann O'Brien. She is a director of our market opportunities and market assessments group here within our reimbursement, health economics, and market access team. Additionally, Nicole Fitzpatrick, who is an associate director on our team, she heads up our evidence and healthcare economics team, as well as John Schmitt, an associate director on our strategy team with specialization in commercialization. And as noted, my name is Michael Anselmo. I am the vice president and co-head of our reimbursement, health economics, and market access team. Next slide, please. So a quick agenda of our webinar. So we are going to touch on some basic coding coverage and payment, and then discuss moving beyond those. We're going to discuss perspectives on value, as well as understanding stakeholder perspectives. One of the things we do want to concentrate on today are some frictions in the buying process, specifically around providers and payers, as well as interest of government stakeholders and your investor stakeholders. We will be reserving time at the conclusion of the webinar to address any questions or answer any questions from the audience. And if there are leftover questions we have not been able to answer, we will send out answers to those questions afterwards. Next slide. So just a quick discussion around our reimbursement, health economics, and market access team here at MCRA. So we span the entire product lifecycle, from our clinical trial reimbursement services all the way through to our market opportunity service, evidence services, general reimbursement strategy, as well as patient access and provider and stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. So we'd like to address this first section is moving beyond traditional coverage, coding, and payments. Next. So if we address some key reimbursement fundamentals, these are some of the basics we address with all of our clients. This is the reimbursement standard, we'll refer to as 101. Really, you're going to work towards the three pillars, which are coverage, the building of evidence and payment and patient demand to establish and optimize payer coverage. Further, there is coding, so that is telling a payer or someone what you've done, and then ultimately payment. So if you've told them what you've done, a payer agrees to pay for it, there will be a payment rate. So, this is a standard payment methodologies that exist. These are things such as DRGs, CPTs, and the like. So this is kind of our basic standard. Moving to the next slide, please. So when we talk to most of our clients, some of the things we address are, do you fit within current coverage, coding, and payment? at which point, do you need to just address establishing a value for your market access, or do you need to move into separate reimbursement pathways? These are things such as establishing new codes, and creating new coverages for your reimbursement. This is the legacy decision. This is what all technologies generally are faced with. Do they want to establish a new pathway? Do they want to follow the existing pathway? And then as you move forward, there are advantages to staying in the shadows, accepting your current payments, but you'll have immediate payments under existing schedules, or do you step into the spotlight, which is establishing new premiums, but with those comes the disadvantage of needing to create your own pathway. Next slide, please. So in our next, in one of our webinars that we did last year, we focused on alternative pathways. And within those, it was looking at commercialization. It was saying, do you want to follow through with existing coding coverage and payment? Are there other ways you can get paid? These are things such as partnering with payers. These are things such as direct to consumer models. These are bringing value propositions where you may have a technology that does not actually secure its own reimbursement. The key strategic decision here is whether reimbursement should be the focus of your commercialization strategy. And sometimes yes, but sometimes no. There are other things you would take into account when reimbursement is not necessarily what you take. But what's important is to understand these are all questions you should address. These are all things you need to think through and develop a strategy for. Because if you decide to go a reimbursement pathway, you may have problems. Likewise, if you go a non-reimbursement, a alternative commercialization pathway, you may also have problems, but you also may have success. Next slide, please. So as we discuss here, some of the things you really do need to consider, regardless of the pathway you take, are the friction you create. If we all think about it, we are trying to create products that can be sold that, in a lot of cases, are frankly resold. They are sold to a provider. Ultimately, that provider will turn around and bill a payer. So within this, frictions are created. Are there things that are done? And one of the things we want to focus on are some of these problems when you don't think through your full reimbursement and commercialization strategy. Are you going to cause problems within your sales force because there's not reimbursement, there's not proper commercializations? And we want to focus on fixing these and addressing these ahead of time. Next slide, please. So one of the important things to remember, especially as we discuss friction, is reimbursement is just one part of the healthcare ecosystem. You have the patients, you have providers, you have payers, you have health systems, you even have the government, you have your own investors. Reimbursement is a very integral part, but it is only one part. However, it is the part that can probably cause the most friction. Next slide, please. As we note within the healthcare ecosystem, there are a large number of participants. And, this is just a brief focus here, as you talk to the provider systems, the caregivers, employers, benefit consultants, brokers, you have a whole variety of people who are interested in this, with the consumer who, we can refer to as a number of different ways: patient, member, employee, user, customer, all at the center. It is creating a device, creating a product to be used for a patient, and then how everyone else will take that into account. Next slide, please. So what we focused on here is really a number of key stakeholders that really can cause significant frictions, that can cause technologies to succeed or technologies to fail based on how easy that sale is, how difficult it is, how problematic it is, how successful the procedure may be, but then also how successful the economics are. So we've got patient, as I said, at the center, but we also have the health plan, providers, government, you have different vendors. And then, as a company, one thing you do need to take into account is your board, your investors, your advisors, and how they'll all react. So what we want to do is kind of delve into some of the frictions and some of the problems that can arise with all of these different stakeholders to understand, what are some things you need to be aware of, some things you need to prepare for, and some things you need to address early on. Next slide, please. So with that, I will hand it off to Ann O'Brien, who will discuss some common provider frictions that come up.
Hi, I'm Ann. I'm a director on the reimbursement team focused on market assessments. And what we help clients do is really take a look early on to help streamline the process to avoid some of these frictions. And what I'll focus on a bit is the provider frictions. And as Mike mentioned, there are many stakeholders, and even within the provider group, we have physician stakeholders, we have facility stakeholders, and none of their incentives to use a product always or often align. And although the goal ultimately of manufacturers is to get the best preferred technologies into the hands of providers to treat patients and have really good clinical outcomes, that's not really the only thing that you need to think about as you go forward with your commercialization strategy. You want to think about how to get it into physicians' hands and avoid some of these frictions. And some of these things come down to coverage and coding and payment and considering, so we have coverage policies and they're not consistent. Providers might have, patients with all sorts of coverage policies that are inconsistent. So it's very important for manufacturers to help providers understand these policies, and when possible, engage with the payers to change these policies to get better coverage for the technology. And that's more of a traditional example, but there's also many other frictions to consider. If there's codes available, what are the payments for the physicians and the facilities, and are they what is expected? And could they potentially be modified with a different coding strategy? So all of these things play into different roles, and providers look at these items when they're deciding what technologies they can utilize. And things like society guidelines and evidence are really important too. So even if there is coverage and coding, you also want to provide the clinical support, the data, to make providers feel very comfortable with these use cases. Next slide, please. So I wanted to walk through a couple different examples of really great technology that had tons of potential, but because some of these frictions weren't thought about early on, it didn't really see the success that it could have. So the first example is a diagnostic test for coronary artery disease. And there's been a lot of innovation in the space of diagnostic testing, which has been great because you can save money with not having to go through different invasive tests, imaging. So it can be more efficient in many different ways. So in this particular example, it was a blood test that could rule out coronary artery disease. And it did show promising results. And there was a very strong value proposition with time savings and cost savings. However, there are lots of headwinds, and some of the items that should have been considered early on were not, right? Because the most important thing in diagnostic testing is that you can modify the care and that you can avoid potentially the other more invasive or expensive testing. And if a diagnostic test doesn't allow the treatment to be modified or the other tests to be considered still necessary, then it doesn't have as much value. So it would add cost without having a clear utility. And in this situation, it was uncertain exactly what patient would utilize the diagnostic test. So I think it's really important for companies early on to think about the potential frictions that could be encountered, and in early planning, speak to the end users, whether that's the physicians or the facilities, and really understand where in the care pathway the technology fits, right? Would it be with a cardiologist or a primary care physician? What would be the ideal patient population? Work with KOLs and specialty societies. It's really important to get their buy-in early. And then the clinical study design has to be one that can show utility, how could it actually modify how patients are treated or diagnosed? If you're going to do a blood test and then you also have to have a patient go through imaging, it's not really saving time or money or showing true clinical utility. So if you think about all of these things at the beginning and then make sure that your clinical study are designed to show not just statistical significance, but also clinical value, that's really important early on. Next slide, please. And then another example I wanted to run through is in the remote monitoring space. And I know we've seen tons of technologies take off, some start to take off and then, not really reach their full potential. So in this situation, we have a remote monitoring technology with advanced AI algorithms. And this would be, it would provide the physicians extra advancements in monitoring. There are remote monitoring codes that are used, so it should be, somewhat of a no-brainer. We have the coding, we have the enhanced features. This should be not so much friction, but I think in this situation, there are other frictions that exist, more in the name of coverage and then the payments that go along with the remote monitoring. So although everyone's familiar with the remote monitoring codes, many of the payers don't cover remote monitoring. So just because you have a code doesn't necessarily mean there's coverage or payment. So this is one of the classic examples right now of where that's happening. So you might have Medicare pay for it, but you wouldn't have a private payer. And then there is some risk for the practice if they're going to utilize remote monitoring when not necessarily all their patients will have it covered. There are devices that might need to be purchased and they're not necessarily comfortable with some of that upfront payment risk. So although on the face of it, it seems like a very good technology, there are all of these frictions in terms of coverage and payment. So in this scenario, I think coverage might not change overnight, and that's why in the interim, to help overcome the frictions, provider education is necessary. So helping support providers to understand which plans cover remote patient monitoring, getting prior authorization assistance, and giving them more clarity around some of the complexities in coding and billing, some of the requirements that go along with RPM. And considering different business models to reduce overhead costs and some of the initial payment risk that could be associated with the devices. Think creatively about how to help practices purchase that upfront and not have so much risk. So I think there's many different ways in this remote monitoring environment that manufacturers can help the providers utilize it without so much in the way of hiccups. Next slide. And then I wanted to pass it over to my colleague, Nicole, and she's going to talk a bit about the payer frictions.
Perfect. Thanks, Anne. So hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Fitzpatrick. I'm an Associate Director of Reimbursement, Health Economics, and Market Access here at MCRA, and my focus is on evidence strategy and health economics. So, now we'll shift to understanding the payer perspective and discuss some frictions that can arise specifically when approaching payers for coverage of a new technology. So the goal of most companies when approaching payers should be to establish the value of their product versus the standard of care. And sometimes that is the first friction. So aligning on what is considered to be the standard of care from the payer perspective, and then having evidence to support that, your value versus the standard of care. So as you can imagine, to show efficacy of your product for FDA, you might want to use a sham procedure, for instance. Well, that won't necessarily be a good comparator from the payer perspective because they'll want to see it versus the standard of care. So another common friction is showing improvement in a real world setting. So for FDA, they really want to see the efficacy of your product, which is often done in a clinical trial under ideal conditions in a very well-controlled setting. So payers want to understand the effectiveness of the technology. So does it work in real life under real life conditions? So, where physicians might be using this on a population that's, beyond the confines of the clinical trial, or maybe with slightly different procedure conditions, for instance. And then you'll also need to be very clear about the unmet need that the technology addresses. And we often see this conflated with the burden of the condition. So, not necessarily just the burden or the prevalence of the condition, but it's really more about the gap in care. So, what is that unmet need within that care pathway for the very specific population that your product addresses? And sometimes that can be much more nuanced and a little bit trickier to establish. Another friction that we often see is the target population. So, when you're approaching investors, you want to make your addressable population very large, right? This is a big problem for lots of different people. However, when approaching payers, you need to be much more nuanced and very deliberate about the target population that should be eligible for coverage. And this then should align very closely with your evidence package. And then in addition to clinical effectiveness, payers want to understand both resource utilization and clinical utility. So resource utilization, things like ED visits, reoperation rates, rehospitalizations, downstream procedures, medication usage, anything that's specific to the care pathway of your technology. And does your product impact the rates of these different resource utilization? And these, translate to cost for the payer. So they really want to understand, how your technology will impact these utilization metrics. And then I know Anne touched on clinical utility a little bit. I think that's something that we hear often from the payer side as well is, how does this product, look from a clinical utility perspective? And you often see this with diagnostics. I pulled this definition actually from the National Cancer Institute. So it's the likelihood that a test or technology will, by prompting an intervention, result in improved health outcome. And so the way I like to think of it is whether it's really useful to clinical decision making. Does it impact, the treatment or diagnostic decisions within that care pathway, or is it just kind of a nice to have? And so that's something that's a little bit trickier, I would say, for some technologies to show. And then finally, the quality of published evidence. We hear this a lot from the payers. Studies should have a robust study design and methodology, so an RCT or some other comparative design with a well-established protocol and analysis plan, and ideally having the study published in a high-tier journal. So those are just some examples that we see fairly often of payer frictions when approaching payers for coverage. Certainly not comprehensive, and certainly, if you were to be, using a different pathway and maybe approaching a payer, for purchase, for instance, that certainly changes the equation. So go ahead and just the next slide. Okay, so then I wanted to just showcase a couple of different payer friction scenarios. The first one that you see here is about a liquid biopsy for ctDNA detection. So this is circulating tumor DNA detection. And the friction here is that it's an emerging or very rapidly evolving therapeutic area. So the consequences that you see are often inconsistencies across private payer medical policies, or the payer policies may not reflect the current clinical practice or the most up-to-date clinical guidelines. Payer policies may not cite the most recent evidence. There may be uncertainty from the payer side as to how to categorize the product within the coverage policies. And a lot of this can result in claim denials, really due to lack of payer familiarity or knowledge. And there's actually been quite a bit of commentary in the literature around this topic. So I pulled out you can see on the bottom, I pulled out an article called Private Payer and Medicare Coverage Policies for Use of Circulating Tumor DNA Tests in Cancer Diagnostics and Treatment. And I pulled out a quote there I thought was interesting. So within this publication, they reviewed a ton of different payer coverage policies around ctDNA testing. And the quote is that they found a wide variation and complex language specifying coverage and payer policies, different indications within each policy, and sometimes multiple policies to address each clinical indication. So just a ton of variability in that space across the payers, not much consistency. And then over on the right, you can see another article. So some recommendations for the equitable and widespread implementation of liquid biopsy for cancer care. And they offer some solutions for this issue. So first and foremost is just education. So educating on the emerging data, the use cases, interpretation of the data that complement or provide alternatives to the standard of care will become increasingly necessary. And that's really across all stakeholder groups, but certainly on the payer side as well. And then secondarily, ensuring the development of an evidence package that very clearly outlines the analytical validity, clinical validity, and clinical utility is critical for adoption and payer coverage. So that really kind of showcases the recommendations. So for this specific client, our recommendations were, first and foremost, to really narrow in on a specific use case or a specific population. So, in this case, this technology can be applied to screening, diagnosis, minimum residual disease detection, treatment selection, et cetera. So really, to select the specific use case where you have the most supporting evidence, and then simplify and focus your messaging, even tailoring your messaging when you go to outreach to payers. So tailor your messaging to specific payers based on their current state of knowledge. So, really meet them where they're at. And then certainly provide education materials on the current state of the clinical space, the current state of clinical guidelines, how to interpret the data and the evidence that you're providing. And then providing, very succinct and straightforward materials like an evidence dossier to highlight your evidence package for the technology. So really kind of just simplifying and making very straightforward messaging. Okay, so the next scenario. Okay, so the second scenario of a payer friction is for a product that is a device plus a software that detects a physiological biomarker. And this specific one, so I didn't want to say the specific physiological biomarker, but we can use, handwriting analysis, for instance. But really this physiological biomarker can be applied to numerous use cases. So in this case, concussion, dementia, or Parkinson's. And, as I mentioned previously, this is really great from the investor standpoint. You have multiple large populations that you could potentially impact. But from the payer standpoint, the payers may be more concerned about coverage of these multiple large populations and, the ensuing payment for these large populations. So in addition, you could, from the product perspective, you may have an evidence portfolio that's scattered across these different populations and maybe not as focused as needed. And so here, what we recommended was to really do some strategic work up front to select that initial target population. So, look at payer coverage policies to understand the current payer perspective for each of these indications. Are they covering similar technologies or not? And, what does that mean for how you're going to position to them? Do primary research with payers or other stakeholders like providers to really, understand the current state of thinking from their perspective. Do a market opportunity assessment or competitive research to understand how to position in the current market. Do things like a burden of illness study or a patient journey analysis to really understand the barriers for each indication and get some quantitative data around the unmet need or gap in care to support, your product positioning. And then once you do some of that strategic work, you can, select a specific population to target initially, develop your evidence and your value proposition very systematically for each different population, and then initiate your coverage requests on that more narrow, a more narrow population initially, with a goal to eventually expand to, your secondary and tertiary populations. And just for fun, I included this little cartoon where the doctor is telling the patient that they have a pacemaker for their heart, but you can download apps for your liver, kidneys, lungs, and pancreas. So it can certainly be used for much more. And this is an approach we wouldn't necessarily recommend for payer coverage. You would want to have a much more strategic and systematic approach. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to John Schmitt.
Thank you, Nicole. So turning to the patient and considering their willingness to adopt new technology or participate in innovation, it's often difficult to parse out exactly what patient preferences are, and what else in the system might be causing those specific preferences. Is this a scenario where, as Henry Ford would say, are people just stuck wanting faster horses, or are they ready to move on to cars, or is there a secondary reason for that friction? There's a lot of fingers in the pot here, a lot of different idiosyncratic reasons between different therapeutic areas or other segments. And on top of that, patients are often shielded from those incentives. If you think of an extreme example, patients just aren't used to paying for medical care in a lot of instances. So if there's additional out-of-pocket expense, you might have a lot of friction there. The other complication is that this changes through the year, and this might impact you or your provider customers. Patients start the year with full deductibles. They often have cost sharing throughout the year, but this can really have a tangible impact on provider financials. So if you're selling a sort of a high cost, high quality style product or service, you should be prepared for harder objections at the start of the year. And, maybe to the extent of it might make sense to modify your sales strategy at the start of the year to address that, especially if you're selling to the independent provider segment, perhaps. Looking to the right here, that statement on the right, it's something we see a lot with new products describing their unmet need. We also see a lot on the health policy side. There's this assumption that a need is unmet because patients don't have access. If it exists and certain groups aren't using it, it must mean they don't have access. And then, applying that to the principles of supply and demand, it's a supply problem. And a lot of times this is really a false assumption. And if you go to the next slide, please, we'll talk about a scenario where that assumption was costly. So the scenario here is an employer group focused type pair that's piloting a digital platform in behavioral health. And the primary unmet need here was rural employer groups. And the platform is a mixture of innovative technology to enhance quality, continuity of care, and then also to magnify the impact of labor, or sort of make it more efficient. You can do more with fewer providers. And some context here is that payers have specific requirements around their networks to be sort of a compliant health plan. So it's things like distance from providers of a certain specialty, number of days before a patient can get an appointment, and network adequacy in general is very hard in rural areas. It's very hard in the behavioral health area. So if you combine that with sort of a recent history of less than stellar outcomes data on the behavioral side in rural populations, this is a match made in heaven on the supply side. The conclusion would be that creating additional access to those behavioral health providers, making it more efficient, would alleviate these problems. The challenge here, though, when they launched the pilot, they found a good portion of the patients they were really trying to serve here had major trust issues with remote behavioral health providers. Specifically the population they're trying to alleviate here. It's hesitancy that makes sense. It's in their mind, it's hesitancy to tell an anonymous person on the internet through my employer health plan that I have a mental health issue. So that that segment really valued that privacy. So the issue is that the vendor then had to go back and create a dual solution, one with and one without a human. There's cost in doing so, delayed implementation, delayed revenue, and in some instances, you might have a dissatisfied pilot partner. So that's just, if you do your segmentation ahead of time, really think through patient incentives. Those are things you might be able to avoid. Next slide, please. So another stakeholder we want to look at is on the regulatory side. So in the US, we have a very complex web of regulatory stakeholders and controlling the use and sale of medical products and services in different ways. Each one has different frameworks, standards, requirements. A lot of this related to Nicole's comments. That's where this often comes up if you're talking about FDA and safe and effective standards versus payers and CMS, reasonable and necessary, medically necessary. That's probably where most innovative technologies get tripped up in these distinctions. But CMS also has different statutory definitions and benefit frameworks that don't necessarily line up with the FDA. So in this example, it's a hip traction device, and it's specifically called that by the FDA. It's not, there are specific exercise equipment product classifications, but this was called a traction device. But when they went to apply for a code from CMS, they didn't have enough clinical data on medical outcomes, and this was in 2015, and medical outcomes specifically. So CMS said, your FDA classification doesn't matter. I mean, they take it into account, but it's not the end all be all. And since you can't show that medical outcome, and Medicare doesn't cover exercise equipment, they got mapped to essentially a non-payable code labeled as exercise equipment. And it took them almost 5 years to overcome this. And that's 5 years of restricted access to the insurance market. And I say insurance market specifically because this is not just a Medicare problem. It's not just that Medicare doesn't cover the device. It's that they mapped it to a code that commercial payers also don't pay. So, thinking about, what you could have done differently in this scenario, there's probably, this is a exercise adjacent device, to say the least. So maybe some friction was unavoidable. Sometimes you can do everything right, but you're pushing the envelope, and so there's going to be friction. But if you'd started thinking through this ahead of time, planning your clinical studies, your endpoints, and your applications, maybe you could have shortened that lag time by a couple of years. Recently we've seen in the exoskeleton space, in braces, there are new high-tech exoskeletons in the market, and there was some disagreements among the CMS work group, the HCPCS work group, exactly how those will fit in. And those companies really did a great job of having their arguments laid out, and they pushed the envelope in the right way. It was probably a couple-year delay, maybe just over a year. They had to go through a few extra application cycles, but it wasn't sort of a 5-year wall that they hit. They really sort of mitigated the risk to their growth. Next slide, please. So another CMS consideration here, and moving a little bit towards the financial side. So something that's common to see when we're looking at financial pro formas, especially for startups, is rising prices. Throughout later years have higher prices. Basically, the assumption would be the reimbursements are going to go up. The extreme side, we see some people use medical inflation, which we all know is a very high number. Most often, I get the sense that this is just a result of people using, I'll say recycling financial modeling templates and they just have built-in price escalators. But the issue here is when you're doing that, it's not necessarily accurate to exactly how the market, why spending goes up, right? It's a price versus quantity kind of issue. And so your financial models can be impacted and wrong, I'll just say. So Medicare is essentially a fixed pie in a way to their budget. So when more services are added, new technologies come into the mix in the Medicare program, the total spend has to stay the same. So as a result, other payments, prices, reimbursements, whatever you want to call them, go down. In recent years, there have been a lot of new service categories created. We've seen decreases south of 5% to that sort of conversion factor that governs prices. And this is something, you look at the comments and people are clamoring for CMS to do something. This is something that requires Congress to address. And in the last several years, Congress has come in kind of last minute rescues to the conversion factor. But, this is last minute rescues. They're unpredictable. It's not something that it's can be necessarily relied on. And just like with the benefit category discussion in the last slide, this doesn't just impact Medicare. Many commercial contracts are directly based on Medicare rates, often just a straight percentage of those rates. So, this can affect your financial performance across your payer segments. Last thing, before I move on, the model on the right, it's illustrative. Before you go throwing that into financial models, it assumes no legislative changes, continued budget trends, and assumes, no congressional rescues. It's kind of what happens if things are left to their own devices. So just a caution before you use that as future truth. And I'm going to hand it back to Mike now.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So we'll address the final stakeholder here, which is your investors. This is your board. And so what? What could possibly go wrong here? We start to look through all these and, early preparation, early thought can avoid a lot of these problems, but not addressing these things can cause a lot of challenges later on. Next slide, please. What we can see, and frankly, I have seen at places I've worked, at clients I've consulted with, are coverage challenges and delays. You take a product to market and there's no reimbursement, which now means that you can sell it, but there's no payment on the back end for it. So our provider's going to buy it. Incorrect segmentation. It's going out and not targeting the right people. We've seen some things get targeted towards the wrong specialty, the wrong stakeholder, not understand, what are your incentives, but what are their incentives? Why are they going to buy it? And if there's not a good answer of, I'm going to buy this because X, you may see challenges there and not purchasing. Going on to John's last point, mispricing. This is a common one. You have to think of the economic case that your clients are going to, your customers are going to have. Are you selling them a widget for $100 that they're going to get paid $50 for? If that's the case, they're not going to buy it unless there's a real other value. Likewise, if you're selling it for 100 and they can turn around and get 1,000, maybe your price is too low. So those are all things that have to be considered. Then you have demand. It's looking at the number of patients. Are there enough? Is there enough time? And then costs. Remembering that some of these procedures, some of these services, require other things. It's going out and saying, you're going to get reimbursed $100. Well, I want to charge you $100. Well, there's time, effort, things that go into it, and maybe that's a disincentive. And really, what this all leads to is poor sales. If there are frictions, if there are concerns, and there are problems, people are just not going to buy your device, and then that causes another series of problems for you as a company that your investors are going to be concerned of, and we'll look at those on the next slide. The direct consequences here. You're going to spend a lot of money on sales and marketing. Sales teams are not cheap, neither are marketing teams, and if you're paying for those and you're not able to sell, you're burning your cash. You delay your revenue. There are fixes to all of these issues, but they're not all instantaneous. You may have a 2-year delay while coding gets straightened out or while coverage gets straightened out, and now you're pushing your revenue out. And if you're trying to sell your company or raise money, a dollar today is worth a lot more than a dollar in 2 years. Not to mention lost revenue there. So you play with your revenue, you can really play with your financials. There's lower margins. If you have to go out and change your pricing structure late in the game, now you're lowering your margins more than you expected to, and that can have other issues. And lastly, we see this with a lot of novel technologies, is we know there's always followers. One of the most powerful things you have is your first mover advantage. It's coming in, it's getting entrenched, it's selling into a market that is all blue ocean. And if you delay these and, you lose your first mover advantage. And, before you are entrenched in the market, your first competitor has now launched their product, and now your second one, and now you're fighting for each individual sale. So, we'll now look to kind of what secondary issues these have for companies. Next slide, please. The questions we'll have is, will you be able to pivot? There are always pivots on these, but will you be able to? Will your board allow you to? I've seen projects where 2 months of work towards a pivot is done and it is shot down by the board in 4 minutes. If they presented that before it was a crisis, before it was a pivot, but as an alternate strategy, or even as a better strategy, it's not a pivot, it's not the delays, it's just, straight out, are you burning more your cash? Do you have enough runway? If you need to be, cash flow neutral in a year and you've got a 2-year delay, you have a problem. You're going to run out, and that's going to cause you to need to do things. Will your board allow you to lower your margins? Communicating price, communicating margins, communicating profits, those are all things that get built into your financial models. Will they be allowed? Are you going to go to a board meeting and say, we're going to cut the price of our widget from 200 to 100? And now, those financial projections get cut in half and you've got angry investors. And these all lead to, will your board then allow you to raise more cash? You raise money, and if you raise money saying, hey, we're going to exit after our C round, if you need to go to a D, now you've got investors who came in thinking it was low risk, it was high probability win here, and now they are going to get diluted. Will they allow that? Will they be happy when they have to come up with more money to go in for their investment? That is concerns that can happen. And we'll see some other issues on the next slide. And within those, we have the secondary consequences, dilution. If you raise more money, now you're diluting your existing shareholders. Employee turnover, do you need to reduce your sales team while you wait? Do you have employees that thought they were, a year and then a sale and now they're moving on? Executive replacement. Let's be frank here. I have seen CEOs get fired for missing these targets and having to go, reorganize. This is a case where the board may make changes. Early exits and liquidations are even worse consequences, to the point where company runs out of money. So how do we really get around these? And, let's move to the next slide and talk to kind of avoiding these. The solutions, minimize your growth stage delays by taking proactive actions. If you fix these problems and address these before you are spending a lot of money on sales teams, before you are expecting to be out and be being, highly profitable, address it early when it's not impacting sales. Address some of these problems, get your pricing right, get your market access strategy right, segment your targets correctly. Addressing those early will mean when you launch, you are ready to launch, you are ready to come in. Or, if you are already in the market, addressing them as soon as you can. Fixing it, if you're having the problem, just say, this is a problem we need to fix here and we may need to change. Understand and present to your board your known unknowns. There are things that, frankly, you don't know. That's one of the cases where you may bring in consultants, you may bring in experts who know a little more. It may be further research, it may be further market segmentation. There's a lot of things you can do to kind of try to figure out what you don't know and what you can figure out. Next is, base your financial projections and how stakeholders are likely to react, not how you think they should react, not how you want them to react. As we've seen, purchasers may decide to purchase based on a variety of reasons. You have to remember a lot of providers, they are essentially their own company. If you sell to a doctor's office, that is often owned by a doctor. Why are they buying your product? What does it mean for them? If they're going to lose money, what are they getting for it? And that frankly is why they may or may not decide to buy the product, and addressing those questions and understanding, they're going to buy this product because X. And if we think they're not going to buy it, how do we change it to get them to the point where we think they're going to buy it? Not just, in the overall, it's going to improve this or there's a missing market here, but really understanding what is the true value here. Next is don't be penny wise and pound foolish on your early stage valuations. Getting yourself in trouble with early stage valuations, saying we're going to raise a smaller round because we don't want to dilute. And, frankly, not having enough money to do some of these things, not having enough money to properly think through your commercialization strategy, to look at all the reimbursement impacts here. Making sure that, you are properly funded to really get through these things in your early stage valuations. And yes, that may dilute your early stage shareholders more, but it's better than diluting everybody later on. And then, kind of to close this out, let's move to the next slide. What we really recommend is consider, your reimbursement, health economics, and market access strategies before you're in crisis. And if you're in crisis, it's kind of own up to it, come in and say, let's get this fixed. What can we do? But most important, it's incorporating commercial strategy and impacts in very early stage planning. People ask me all the time, when should I bring you in? And my answer is always, you probably should have brought me in a few months ago or a few years ago. Because, small changes you can make, to Nicole's point, adjustments to your early studies can be the fix you need that later on when you launch, you're ready to go. You don't need to say, hey, we need another study. We need to find this, or we've got this major gap in concern. I've seen somewhere it's that small fix, that small adjustment. And then there's remembering that some of these actions they take a lot of time, so getting started early, being ready, reaching out to payers. You don't want to do that before you are approved by the FDA. However, there's a run up, there's preparation work that needs to happen. So if you wait to start that until you get your FDA approval, you're now delaying by months until you can reach out. And now that is a multi-year process generally. So if you started that earlier, you kind of get to that earlier, you get to your success, you've got your sales team running and you're ready to go. So with that, we will move on. I believe next up we have questions, and I see a lot of questions that came in through the chat. So let me try to start out at the top and go all the way back. So John, I will address this one to you. Can you consult if the product is already on the market and mapped within DRG coding?
Yeah, there are very specific DRGs are based within a distribution. So it's if you're far enough outside the distribution, the cases with using your technology, then yeah, there are ways to get DRG reconsiderations, and same on the outpatient side. But there's absolutely ways to we can do cost and claims analysis on that to see if it's something worth pursuing.
Awesome. Sounds great. Nicole, I will address this one to you. Can you provide an example about the difference between clinical validity and clinical utility?
Yeah, sure. So clinical validity is usually tied to the clinical outcome. So, let's take a diagnostic test for lung cancer, for instance. So the clinical validity would be, does the patient actually have lung cancer? Clinical utility is a little bit different. So that would be, the likelihood that it's going to alter the treatment pathway. So the treatment or diagnostic pathway. So will the physician take the results of that test and basically use them to initiate additional diagnostic testing or initiate treatment based off of the results? And sometimes it comes back to the physician confidence in the test. So we usually recommend starting with physician interviews or surveys to really understand how they foresee incorporating that into the care pathway and what evidence they might need to instill confidence in those results.
Awesome. Next up, I will send to Anne. Does MCRA offer a service to help ASCs identify which payer mix is covered for their zip code? So the providers are able to tell what is consistently covered.
Yeah, so we do often look at payer mix on the state level. It can be sometimes challenging to engage on a zip code level. But I think there could be potentially ways to work sort of from a bottom up to see that.
Yeah, I know I've seen some sources I've worked with in the past where we can kind of build coverage maps to really understand who and what are covered. So I think, it just kind of depends on the data we'll dive into. I will send the next one over to Nicole. It is very difficult to get in front of payers. So is it done on email or face-to-face? And do they have a schedule as to when they accept inputs?
Yeah, so we do engage payers. We typically, what we do is we'll reach out to specific payers. We'll look at the most relevant coverage policy. So if the product's currently on a coverage policy that's labeled as experimental investigational, for instance, we can reach out and look at the specific date. So sometimes we'll have the date for the next review on that specific coverage policy, and we can reach out around that date. We'll often put together an evidence package that would include a dossier that describes the clinical or health economic evidence for the product, really outlines the value proposition nicely, send that over to the payer in a direct outreach, right around when that review timeframe is going to occur.
Awesome. I will send this one. This is one of my favorite questions. John, you can address it, but what is the average commercial payment rate versus Medicare payment rates?
It's your favorite question because it has the worst kind of answer. It depends. It largely depends on site of service. The difference between sort of an independent office-based provider is between 100, 150%. As you start getting to hospitals and facilities, recent studies have estimate, upwards of 250%, and then inpatient, it's even higher. It also depends on market characteristics, competition, academics. Recently, there's been some regulation that's forcing transparency in these prices. So we have data assets, and we look at specific. We can look at specific hospital pricing and payer contract data to get if folks have specific questions on that. That's something we can now get specific answers to.
Awesome. Anne, I will send this one to you. Is FDA clearance mandatory prior to submitting to AMA a request for new CPT code category 3 or prior to the panel meeting?
No, it is not. It is only required for a category 1 code, but you can even have a CPT category 3 code during an ID study.
Yeah. Now, one issue I will bring up, and we've seen this recently, is you may have coverage issues. You will likely have very strict non-coverage if there's no FDA clearance. So you can get your code, but using it becomes difficult. John, I will send this one to you. During fundraising, my investors always chop my projections. It doesn't matter if I'm conservative, they'll assume it's too optimistic. How do I balance realism with investors with the need to maintain some rose-colored glasses? Do you have particular areas where my investors might recognize or accept conservative assumptions?
That's a really great question. I think, first thing I'll say is there's probably a difference between pre-funding communication and post-funding communication. And I think investors know, you need funding to do market assessments. So your pricing estimates might not be as good as you're negotiating valuations. I'll also say that the more you can call out, I think assumptions, you call out the conservative assumptions you're making, and it can put them in a specific light. Assumptions like time to market can often be even more impactful in evaluation than price. And I think more likely than not, investors are just the first thing they're going to do is slash your price. So that might be something that can they might actually listen to. The other thing I've seen work very well is create scenarios. Do the cutting for them in a way that's, and I wouldn't say beneficial to the truth and your more accurate assessments. So create a best case scenario, realistic scenario, worst case, and you can kind of steer their thought process proactively.
Awesome. And then we are running out of time, so I will have one more question. I'm going to address this to Nicole. How do evidence requirements differ for the various stakeholders, facilities, physicians, payers, and across payers? How do you determine what is needed for coverage for different payers? So a lot there.
That's a lot to unpack. Yeah. I mean, I guess, just to address the one for different payers, I mean, we'll start with coverage policy. So a lot of times, the payer coverage policies have a lot of detailed and nuanced information around, what specific populations they cover. They have great literature review sections that basically provide the literature, the evidence that they use to make their decisions. So, we'll start there for the payer side to really understand evidence requirements. One, I guess I'll take facility. I don't think we've talked much about facility, but a lot of times, one of the common things we do are budget impact models on the facility side. So, we'll model out the new technology versus the standard of care and really understand the differences in costs and revenue from the facility perspective, and that will resonate with the value analysis committees on the facility side who are making those decisions on adoption of new technologies.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. And I know we had a bunch of other questions, just we're at time, but if anyone has any, wants to really follow up, please reach out to us, set up some time. We're happy to have discussions around a lot of these and, see if a partnership would be a beneficial idea. So, please join us for our next webinar, LDT versus IDT, adapting to the new FDA regulations that will occur June 16th at 10 a.m. Eastern. And with that, we will conclude our webinar this morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank my panel, Nicole and John. Great job. Thank you very much. As always, please reach out and let us know how we can help. Thank you.